I'm not racist, you're racist. It's the argument Donald Trump is sticking with as he escalates his attacks on 13-term Congressman Elijah Cummings. The president tweeted yesterday, Dems always play the race card when they're unable to win with facts. If racist Elijah Cummings would focus more of his energy on helping the good people of his district and Baltimore itself, perhaps progress could be made in fixing the mess he has helped to create over many years of incompetent leadership. This came in response to backlash Trump got for an earlier string of tweets, which berated Cummings for criticizing conditions at the southern border, calling the Maryland district he's represented since 1996, quote, a disgusting, rat and rodent-infested mess, far worse and more dangerous than the border and the worst in the USA. Naturally, Democrats in Baltimore and beyond were quick to respond.
We're not going to ignore anyone degrading Baltimore City and its elected leadership. No one.
To be attacked by a president issuing racist tweets is beyond insulting. It is disgusting.
He attacks everybody. I know Donald Trump, but he has a particular venom for blacks and people of color.
Of course, this is the second time Trump has feuded with Congresspeople of color in just as many weeks, after telling 4 congresswomen earlier this month, all of them American citizens, to go back to where they came from. So as Democrats rally to oppose the president's statements, could this actually increase Trump's chances of keeping the White House for 4 more years? Joining me are Carl Williams, lawyer, former racial justice attorney at the Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. Carl, it's good to see you.
It's good to see
Atyia
you.
Martin is the founder of All Aces, Inc. and the former chief resilience officer for the city of Boston. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Tom Whalen, associate professor of social science and American history at BU. Good to see you, Tom. Thanks. Can we divide this into short-term and long-term impact? Start with the short, if I can, with you, Carl, for a second. You know, unlike what many of us thought this was going to hurt Donald Trump, the growing body of conventional wisdom that I've read is that Trump scores points with white working class voters with this kind of doubling and tripling down that will likely help him next November. Do you buy that?
I think it goes from maybe people like him to people love him. Is that going to get him more votes? I don't know that that's going to mobilize people. The question is, you know, how are progressives, Democrats, people who stand for racial justice going to be mobilized?
How much does it trouble you to even say the words you just said, by the way? They go from like to love, the more he does what he does in this front.
Well, the question is, are there people who are racist in this country? And there are, right? And there are people who hearken to maybe olden times that say, you know, I'm better than somebody in this country. I'm better than a group of people.
You know, interesting piece was done at Atyia by the Washington Post. They looked at white millennials in 2016. I don't know if you've seen this. And they looked at whether or not racial resentment or economics were what drove them to Trump in 2016, those who voted for him. And their conclusion, based on scientific data, with not just random notes, was racial resentment did it even with white millennials who voted for him. So if it worked then, there's no reason to think it won't work again, or is there?
I mean, if we're talking politics, which isn't usually my forte, but this idea of the role of racism in how we frame issues, it presents an opportunity for Democrats to reframe the issues, that to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in this country who are hurting, and that for people of color, that pain is a lot worse because of our long history of policies and
practices. So since you don't usually do politics, let me ask you another political question.
Of course.
The conventional wisdom growing as well is the more Democrats rally to the side of people like the squad, the 4 women, the more those Democrats become those 4 women in the minds of voters, which is Trump's strategy, theoretically. So the whole Democratic Party moves further left and arguably more unelectable. The point being that there is a method to his madness. You buy that?
I would say partially yes, because there's also a history in politics of strategic racism, right? Of people leveraging these ideas around who people of color are and how they're supposed to be in these negative lights and stereotypes to be able to stoke the fear of people instead of focusing on the real root causes of issues, institutions, our policies, our practices, we end up then focusing on individuals and communities who are also suffering in the same way that poor white people, middle-class white people are suffering too.
You're the historian. Before I get to your perspective on how this plays out for Donald Trump, here's a really interesting exchange between the acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, and Chris Wallace on Fox News, by the way, I should say, just yesterday. Here it is.
I think you're spending way too much time reading between the lines.
I'm not reading between the lines. I'm reading the lines.
Does anyone watching this program dispute the fact that, or the possibility that if Adam Schiff had said the same thing about the border, that the president would be attacking Adam Schiff in the exact same way today?
I don't think he'd be talking about his crime-infested, rodent-infested district.
He very well could. This is what the president does. He fights, and he's not wrong to do so.
I'm not reading between the lines. I'm reading the lines, which I thought was a pretty impressive line by Chris Wallace. Could this all play to Trump's advantage in 2020?
Absolutely. Trump is worried about now. Recent polling showed an erosion of support among white working-class women and also among suburban white women.
And they like this kind of thing?
Well, race kind of, pardon the expression, trumps everything in politics. If you appeal to them in a racial way, an animus, blame the other, this will make them put aside their other qualms about Trump.
I want to talk long term, if we can, for a second. Now, I have been of the opinion, based on no science, just perception, is even when Trump disappears, whether it's in a year or 5 years, what he has put in place doesn't disappear. But there's an interesting piece in the Globe by David Scharfenberger over the weekend saying he's the most consequential president of our time. And I totally misread what his point was. He says the GOP post-Trump will go back to its old, hardly enlightened, but not openly and corrosively cruel on race. But his contention is because Democrats have finally awakened on the issue and have proposed some pretty important measures from reparations down the line, that will survive Donald Trump, and in effect, by living through this racist horror, we'll end up having a better country. Do you subscribe to that notion?
It's one or the other. Right, it's the pendulum has swung back, and we see it, historically. But this one, it's a hard swing, and it's either one thing or the other. And I think that really has awoken people to say, well, these guys are saying the damn things they believe. Why don't we? Right? Why don't we? And I think that's might be news to Nancy Pelosi. Like maybe someone should send her the memo.
But you don't think it's just an election? I don't mean this crassly, that they're thinking, well, I'm just doing this for election purposes. But when the election is over, they move beyond this to
the
Democrats, Democrats to more bread and butter kinds of issues rather than looking about racial disparities in this country.
There's a lot of them, right? So some of them, I think Ilhan Omar thinks it very deep in where she lives, who she is. I think that's definitely the case. I think AOC, I think Ayanna, I think a lot of these people really deeply believe it, and it's who they are, right?
But I'm talking even presidential candidates who are talking about some of this.
I think there's a lot, not to name anyone specific, but you might, if you want to give me a name, I think some people, it is an issue of the moment.
Any moment in history that this tracks to in terms of progress, or anybody being motivated by a horrible reaction, horrible is a poor choice of words, a strong reaction to the other side that caused them to be emboldened in ways that they had not been before. In this case, I'm talking about the Democrats. Are there examples of that?
Well, I mean, you look at the Republican Party in the 1960s, thanks to Richard Nixon and the Southern Strategy. They were emboldened. They were against, the civil rights legislation. Yeah. They were against busing. And Richard Nixon built the first coalition that showed you could win national elections. This is nothing new for the Republican Party. 1988, George H.W. Bush was using Willie Horton. He was down 7 points going in September. He uses the Willie Horton racist ads, and he's up by 10 by the end of the month.
Al Gore was the first person to mention Willie Horton.
He did do that in the primaries, but certainly Bush pushed it big time. And George W. was claiming, his supporters were claiming anyway, that John McCain sired a black child in 2000 during the South Carolina primary.
Remember it well.
This has been used.
So will we come out of this better, whether Trump is gone in a year or gone in 5 years? Will the fact that he has doubled and tripled down on this racism, will the side that doesn't buy that wants to eradicate it, be stronger as a result of Trump, or so beaten down by years of it that we don't prosper?
I think it's a conscious decision we have to make in order to arrive at the more hopeful endpoint that you described.
How about a little kid, by the way? I asked Trump, the only time I ever interviewed Trump was during the campaign when I asked him about if he worried about the reaction of little Muslim kids, single-digit age Muslim kids, to his comments. He actually said yes, but we didn't have time to follow it up. A little black or brown kid who hears, little snippets of what the president has said. He or she is going to be the next generation that would lead this fight. How do they react to what they hear?
So, I mean, I have 5 children, and my youngest child is in the green room. Who's
really?
11. And so for us, I still have hope if we are able to commit to some action. I think we need to understand that the complexity of racism is not being addressed in the common conversations we're having in the media. So that's the first layer. The second piece is that for our children right now, this isn't new to them.
Do you buy, can I interrupt you only because I have 30 seconds?
Yes.
Do you buy that? It's maybe not new. It seems to me this is so much more egregious than what we've lived through. Is it? We have 30 seconds.
There's a history of racism in this country and white supremacy, and it's always been here, right, since the founding, in the founding documents of this country. This is unmasked in a way that we haven't seen before. But also, at the same time, the movements that have happened since the election of Trump, the Women's March, the first Women's March, was the largest movement of people for social justice in the history of the world. In the history of the world, right? So people are fighting like hell about immigrants, about LGBTQ folks, about Muslims, about Native American folks. That's happening, and I'm really hopeful that we're going to win. And we've never seen that before.
And I'll just add this.
10 seconds, that's
10
all I got.
seconds. So we have to make a commitment in this society to own our responsibility, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Democrats are not innocent in this conversation about racism, and we have to own our stuff and figure out what it really means to advance racial equity in this country.
To be continued. Tom, nice to see you.
Thanks, Jim.
Atyia, thank you.
Thank you, my dear. I appreciate
the call. It's great
you.
to see you, too. Thanks.